As soon as my baby was born, the doctor told me that the baby was disabled. And as soon as my family heard it, they tried to throw the baby in the trash and said, "No. That's not ours and she's not going back with us." As I looked at my husband for support, he looked disgusted and said, "That's not my kid, you're defective for giving birth to a kid like this." While his mother dragged him out, I called my family, and as soon as they heard the news, they only said, "Excuse me, who are you? We don't have anyone by that name." I didn't cry, I stayed silent. And what I did next left all of them speechless. My name is Claudia, and I was 26 when this all went down. I was married to Ivan for 3 years, and we'd been trying to have a baby for almost 2 of those years. His mother, Doris, lived with us in our small 2-bedroom house, which should have been my first red flag, but I was young and thought I could make it work. She never liked me, always making little comments about how I wasn't good enough for her precious son, but Ivan would just laugh it off and tell me she was old-fashioned. My own family wasn't much better. My parents, Marion and Robert, had always been cold and distant. I was their only child, but they treated me more like an obligation than a daughter. Growing up, I learned that love was conditional in our house. Good grades got you dinner. Perfect behavior got you basic necessities. Any mistake meant silent treatment for days. Still, they were my family, and I thought that meant something. When I finally got pregnant, everyone seemed excited. Doris actually smiled at me for the first time in 3 years. My parents called to check in regularly. Ivan was over the moon, constantly talking about teaching his son how to play baseball and football. He was so convinced it was going to be a boy that he'd already painted the nursery blue and bought tiny sports jerseys. The pregnancy had some complications in the later stages. At my 20-week ultrasound, they detected what they thought might be spina bifida, but Dr. Crane, my obstetrician, said the images were unclear and we'd need to wait until birth to know the severity. He prepared me that there might be challenges, but said many children with mild cases live completely normal lives. I spent months researching and preparing, but nothing could have prepared me for my family's reaction. Labor was long and difficult. 22 hours of contractions that felt like my body was being torn apart from the inside. Ivan held my hand for the first few hours, but as time dragged on, he got increasingly impatient. He kept checking his phone and complaining about missing work. Doris sat in the corner, making disapproving sounds every time I cried out in pain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, my baby's first cry. The relief was overwhelming. I had done it. I had brought my child into the world. But then I noticed the silence in the room. Dr. Crane was holding my baby, wrapped in a pink blanket, but he wasn't smiling. The nurses were exchanging glances. Something was wrong. "What is it?" I asked, my voice hoarse from screaming. "Is she okay?" Dr. Crane came over to me, his face grave. "Claudia, your daughter is beautiful, and as we suspected, she does have spina bifida. It appears to be a moderate case affecting her lower spine. She'll need surgery within the next few days to close the opening, and while there will likely be some mobility challenges, many children with similar cases learn to walk with assistance and live very fulfilling lives." The words hit me like a physical blow. Spina bifida. I knew enough about it to understand what that meant: wheelchairs, surgeries, a lifetime of medical care. But as I looked at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket, all I saw was my daughter. My perfect, beautiful daughter. "Can I hold her?" I whispered. Dr. Crane placed her in my arms, and I felt that instant, overwhelming love that every mother talks about. She was so small, so vulnerable, with the tiniest fingers I'd ever seen. Her eyes were closed, but she made little cooing sounds that melted my heart completely. "She's perfect," I said, tears streaming down my face. That's when Ivan spoke up. "Perfect?" His voice was sharp, angry. "Are you insane? She's defective." I looked up at him in shock. This was the man who had promised to love me in sickness and in health, for better or worse. The man who had spent months talking about how much he loved our baby before she was even born. "Ivan, she's our daughter," I said softly, hoping to reach whatever compassion he had left. But he was backing away from the bed, his face twisted with disgust. "That's not my kid. You're defective for giving birth to a kid like this. I didn't sign up for this." Doris, who had been silent until now, suddenly stood up and marched over to the bed. Before I could react, she reached for my daughter. "No," she said loudly. "That's not ours, and she's not going back with us. Give me that thing." She actually tried to take my baby from my arms. I clutched my daughter closer, protection mode kicking in instantly. "Get away from her!" I screamed, loud enough that 2 nurses came running. "Ma'am, you need to calm down," one of the nurses said to Doris. But Doris was beyond reason. "This isn't our family. We don't claim this. Throw it in the trash where it belongs." The words were like poison. Throw my baby in the trash. I looked at Ivan, desperately hoping he would defend us, defend his own daughter. Instead, he just stood there as his mother grabbed his arm and started pulling him toward the door. "Come on, Ivan. We're leaving. This isn't our problem anymore." And he went. He actually went with her. The last thing I heard him say as they walked out was, "I'll file for divorce papers tomorrow. I'm not dealing with this." The room fell silent except for my daughter's soft breathing. The nurses looked at me with pity, which somehow made everything worse. I was still holding my baby, still in shock from what had just happened. Dr. Crane cleared his throat gently. "Claudia, do you have anyone else I can call? Your parents, maybe?" I nodded numbly and gave him their number. My hands were shaking as I held my daughter, but I tried to stay strong for her. Surely my parents would be different. They were her grandparents. They would love her regardless of any challenges she might face. I could hear Dr. Crane talking in the hallway. "Hello, this is Dr. Crane from St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling about your daughter Claudia and your new granddaughter." "Yes, the baby was born a few hours ago." "Well, there's something I need to tell you." I heard my father's voice getting louder on the other end of the phone, though I couldn't make out the words. Then Drive Crane came back into the room, his face pale. "They want to speak with you," he said, handing me his phone. "Mom?" I said weakly. "Excuse me, who are you?" came my mother's cold voice. "We don't have anyone by that name. You must have the wrong number." "Mom, it's me, Claudia. Your daughter. I just had your granddaughter, and..." The line went dead. They had hung up on me. I stared at the phone for a long moment, not quite believing what had just happened. Then I called back. This time my father answered. "Dad, please, it's Claudia. Why did Mom hang up on me?" "I'm sorry, you have the wrong number. We don't know anyone named Claudia." Click. Dial tone. I called 3 more times. Each time, they either hung up immediately or pretended not to know me. My own parents. The people who raised me, who I had spent every Christmas and birthday with for 26 years, were pretending I didn't exist. I looked down at my daughter, who had opened her eyes and was looking up at me with the most beautiful blue eyes I'd ever seen. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The hurt and shock began to transform into something else. Something harder. Something that would sustain me through what was coming next. I didn't cry, though every instinct told me to break down completely. Instead, I stayed silent and started planning. Dr. Crane had been standing in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama he'd witnessed. He approached the bed carefully. "Claudia, I want you to know that spina bifida has a wide range of outcomes. With proper medical care and support, many children with this condition go on to live full, successful lives. There are excellent support groups, resources, and..." "Thank you," I interrupted quietly. "Can you give me some time alone with my daughter?" He nodded and left, probably relieved to escape the situation. I was alone with Beth. I had decided on her name in that moment, after my grandmother who had passed away when I was 12. She was the only family member who had ever shown me unconditional love. Over the next 3 days in the hospital, I didn't receive a single visitor. Not one phone call. Ivan never came back, not even to get the papers he'd need to sign. My parents didn't call to check on us. I was completely alone, except for Beth. But I wasn't idle during those 3 days. I was researching, planning, and most importantly, I was getting angry. You see, Ivan had made one critical error in his rush to abandon us. In his disgust and hurry to distance himself from his defective wife and child, he had forgotten about some very important details. Details that would come back to haunt him. First, I had spent the last 3 years working as a bookkeeper for his family's construction business. I knew exactly how much money was coming in and going out. More importantly, I knew about the creative accounting they had been doing to avoid paying taxes. The cash payments they never reported. The inflated expenses. The fake invoices. All of it meticulously documented on my computer at home, because I was the one who had been handling their books. Second, Ivan had been having an affair with his co-worker Loretta for the past 6 months. I had known about it for weeks but hadn't said anything, foolishly thinking I could work on our marriage after the baby was born. I had screenshots of their text messages, photos of them together, and even a recording of him bragging to his friends about it at a bar. I had been planning to confront him after Beth's birth, but now I had a better use for that information. Third, the house we lived in wasn't just in Ivan's name. When we got married, he had added me to the deed as a romantic gesture. He'd forgotten about that detail in his rush to abandon us, but I certainly hadn't. On my last night in the hospital, I made a series of phone calls. Not to family, I was done with them forever. Instead, I called a divorce attorney, a tax attorney, and a private investigator. By the time I left that hospital with Beth in my arms, I had set in motion a plan that would systematically destroy every person who had abandoned us when we needed them most. The divorce attorney, Karen Williams, was a shark in a blazer who specialized in high-conflict divorces. When I told her about the affair and showed her the financial records, her eyes lit up. "This is going to be easier than I thought," she said with a grin that made me feel better for the first time in days. "He abandoned you and his disabled child, he's been committing adultery, and he's been hiding assets. In this state, that means you're getting everything." What Ivan didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment longer than even I realized. During those 3 years of marriage, I had been documenting everything without even knowing it. I had always been good with computers from my college accounting courses, and when Ivan started acting suspicious, my natural attention to detail kicked in. Every time Ivan came home late smelling like perfume, I took photos of the receipts in his pockets. Every time he claimed to be working overtime but his paychecks didn't reflect it, I made copies of his pay stubs. Every suspicious phone call, every unexplained expense, every lie, I had kept track of it all in a detailed journal that I originally started just to keep myself sane. "You're very thorough," Karen observed as I handed over my fourth binder of evidence. "Most wives don't have this level of documentation." "Most wives don't spend 3 years being gaslighted by their husbands," I replied. "When someone constantly tells you that you're imagining things, you start keeping proof that you're not crazy. My college roommate Gina, who's now a paralegal, taught me how to document everything properly when I first started suspecting the affair." Karen flipped through pages of printed text messages, bank statements, and photographs. "This affair with Loretta, when did it start?" 6 months ago, but I suspect it was going on longer. Ivan started working late more often about 8 months ago. He began taking phone calls in private, going to the bathroom when his phone buzzed, deleting his browser history every night. I installed monitoring software on our shared computer that tracked his browsing history and discovered he had created a secret email account. I pulled out another folder. He was using that email to communicate with Loretta, but also to look up apartment rentals, divorce attorneys, and ways to hide assets. He was planning to leave me even before Beth was born. The disability just gave him what he thought was a perfect excuse. Karen's expression hardened. So he was premeditated in his abandonment. That makes this even worse legally. The tax attorney, Robert Park, was equally enthusiastic when I showed him the construction company's books. "This level of tax fraud could result in serious jail time," he explained. "The IRS takes this very seriously, especially when it involves as much unreported income as I'm seeing here." But Robert was particularly interested in something else I had discovered. "Claudia, you mentioned that you handled all the bookkeeping for the company. Did you ever notice any irregularities beyond the tax issues?" I nodded and pulled out yet another binder. They were also running an insurance scam. They would report minor accidents and equipment damage that never actually happened, then pocket the insurance payouts. I have documentation going back 2 years. Robert's eyebrows raised. Insurance fraud is a federal crime. Combined with a tax evasion, they're looking at serious consequences. "There's more," I continued. They were also billing customers for materials they never purchased, using substandard supplies instead, and keeping the difference. I found invoices for premium materials alongside receipts for cheap alternatives. Some of these construction projects could be structurally unsafe. "Building code violations, fraud, endangering public safety," Robert muttered, taking notes furiously. "Claudia, this isn't just about taxes anymore. This is about a criminal enterprise masquerading as a legitimate business." I felt a surge of satisfaction. Ivan and his family had built their wealth on lies and theft, and now they were going to pay for every single crime. The private investigator, Maria Santos, had already started working on documenting Ivan's affair and his family's business practices. She was expensive, but I was about to come into some money, so that wouldn't be a problem for long. Maria had a different approach than I expected. Instead of just following Ivan around with a camera, she was conducting a comprehensive investigation in every aspect of his life. "Your husband is sloppy," she told me during our second meeting. "He thinks he's being sneaky, but he's leaving a trail of evidence everywhere he goes." She spread out a series of photographs on the table. Ivan and Loretta at restaurants, holding hands. Ivan buying her expensive jewelry at a store downtown. Ivan helping her move furniture into a condo that I didn't know existed. But here's the interesting part, Maria continued. The condo is in Loretta's name, but the down payment came from your husband's secret bank account. He essentially used marital funds to buy his mistress a love nest. How did you find out about the bank account? I asked. Through legal discovery methods and following paper trails from his financial transactions that you provided, Maria explained. Your documentation made it much easier to trace where the money was going. Maria pulled out more documents. I also did some digging into Loretta's background. Turns out this isn't her first time breaking up a marriage. She's been fired from 2 previous jobs for having affairs with married co-workers. She has a pattern of targeting men with money and stability. So she's a professional homewrecker, I said bitterly. Essentially, yes. But that works in our favor. It shows that your husband was targeted by someone who makes a habit of destroying families. The courts don't look favorably on that kind of predatory behavior. But Maria had saved the best for last. There's something else, Claudia. I've been monitoring Ivan's communications, and I discovered that he and Loretta are planning to leave the state. They think that if they move to a different jurisdiction, it will be harder for you to collect child support or enforce any court orders. My blood ran cold. The thought of Ivan disappearing completely, leaving Beth without even the possibility of financial support from her biological father, was infuriating. When are they planning to leave? I asked. Next month, right after he thinks the divorce will be finalized. He's been selling off assets and converting everything to cash so he can start fresh somewhere else. This was the final piece of evidence I needed. Ivan wasn't just abandoning his family, he was planning to flee the state to avoid any responsibility for his actions. Maria, I need you to document everything. Every plan they make, every asset they try to hide, every step of their escape plan. I want it all on record before they have a chance to run. During this time, I was also dealing with the daily reality of caring for Beth while preparing for legal battles. The early weeks were the hardest I had ever experienced. Beth needed constant medical attention, and I was learning to navigate a healthcare system that seemed designed to exhaust parents of disabled children. There were days when Beth would cry for hours despite my best efforts to comfort her. The surgeries were traumatic for both of us. The first one, to close the opening in her spine, required her to spend 3 days in the pediatric ICU. I slept in a chair next to her bed, watching monitors and praying that my tiny daughter would be strong enough to survive. The doctors and nurses were wonderful, but they couldn't hide their concern about my situation. A single mother with no family support, caring for a high-needs child, while simultaneously fighting a divorce battle, it was overwhelming even by their standards. Do you have anyone who can help you? Dr. Crane asked during one of Beth's follow-up appointments. Caring for a child with spina bifida is challenging even with a full support system. I have my friend Gina, I said. She's been incredible. But other than that, it's just Beth and me. Dr. Crane nodded sympathetically. There are support groups for parents of children with spina bifida. I'd strongly recommend connecting with them. You'll find other parents who understand what you're going through. He was right. The support group became a lifeline during those early months. Meeting other parents who had faced similar challenges, who understood the unique difficulties of raising a child with disabilities, made me feel less alone. But it also made me more angry at my family's abandonment. I sat in those meetings, listening to stories of grandparents who drove hours to help with medical appointments, of siblings who rearranged their lives to provide support, of extended families who rallied around their special needs children. And then I would go home to silence. No phone calls checking on Beth. No offers to help with medical expenses. No cards or flowers or any acknowledgement that we even existed. That anger fueled my determination to see my plan through to the end. Ivan had made the mistake of thinking I was the same weak, dependent woman he had married. He had no idea that taking care of a disabled child requires you to become a warrior. Beth had given me a strength I never knew I possessed. The first phase of my plan took about 8 months to implement. Beth and I had moved in with my college roommate, Gina, who was the only person who didn't abandon me when things got difficult. Gina had always been like a sister to me since our accounting program days, and she had the legal knowledge from her paralegal work to help me navigate the complex processes ahead. She helped me take care of Beth while I attended the countless medical appointments and therapy sessions that came with spina bifida. Beth was doing well, better than the doctors had initially expected, but she still needed surgery to close the opening in her spine. During this time, Ivan had been living it up, thinking he was free. He had moved Loretta into our house, had been posting pictures on social media of their new life together, and had even bought her a car with money from the business. He thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. The first domino fell when Karen served him with divorce papers that demanded 60% of everything, plus alimony and child support. The papers were delivered to him at work, in front of all his co-workers, including Loretta. I heard through mutual acquaintances that his face went white when he saw the list of assets I was claiming, including a significant portion of the construction business. The second domino fell 2 weeks later when the IRS showed up at the construction company with a warrant. Maria had provided them with copies of all the fraudulent documents, and they froze all the business accounts while they conducted their investigation. Ivan and his father James were questioned for hours. But I was just getting started. Ivan tried to call me after the IRS visit, probably hoping to work out some kind of deal. I let it go to voicemail. His message was exactly what I expected: angry, threatening, calling me names, claiming I was destroying his family. There was no mention of Beth, no apology for abandoning his daughter, no acknowledgement of what he had done wrong. Just anger that I wasn't quietly disappearing like he wanted me to. I saved the voicemail and sent it to Karen. "This will be helpful in court," she said with satisfaction. "Judges don't like men who abandon disabled children and then threaten their wives." What Ivan didn't know was that I had been recording all of our interactions since the day he walked out of the hospital. Every phone call, every text message, every voicemail went into my growing file of evidence. His true character was becoming more apparent with each angry outburst. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source: Loretta herself. Maria had managed to get close to Loretta through a mutual acquaintance, and Loretta, apparently feeling guilty about the affair, had started talking. Maria recorded several of their conversations, and what Loretta revealed was devastating for Ivan's case. "He told me the baby wasn't really disabled," Loretta said in one recording. "He said his wife was lying about it to get sympathy and more money in the divorce. He said she was probably just exaggerating some minor birth defect to make him look bad." This was particularly damaging because it showed that Ivan was not only abandoning his disabled child, but actively spreading lies about her condition to justify his behavior. In another recording, Loretta revealed even more disturbing information. Ivan said that even if the baby was really disabled, it would be better off in an institution somewhere. He said normal families shouldn't have to deal with that kind of burden. When Karen heard these recordings, her expression turned cold with fury. "Claudia, this man is not just a deadbeat father. He's actively malicious toward his own child. These recordings are going to destroy him in court." But Loretta wasn't finished. In what would prove to be the most damaging revelation of all, she told Maria about Ivan's plan to flee the state. "He's been selling everything he can without Claudia knowing," Loretta said. "He sold his motorcycle, his tools, even some of his mother's jewelry. He's converted it all to cash and hidden it in a safety deposit box. He thinks that after the divorce is final, we can take the money and disappear to Florida where his cousin lives." "What about child support?" Maria had asked. "He says that they can't find him, he can't pay. He thinks Claudia will just give up and raise the baby on her own. He keeps saying that disabled kids are expensive and she'll probably give it up for adoption anyway once she realizes how hard it is." These recordings painted a picture of a man who was not only abandoning his family, but actively hoping that his disabled daughter would be given away because she was inconvenient. It was beyond cruel, it was sociopathic. I listened to these recordings in Karen's office, and for the first time since this all began, I started to cry. Not from sadness, but from pure rage. The man I had married, the man I had loved, the man who had promised to be Beth's father, was hoping that our daughter would be abandoned by me too. "Karen," I said through my tears, "I want to destroy him completely. I want him to lose everything and face criminal charges for what he's planning." "Is that possible?" Karen's smile was predatory. "Claudia, with this evidence, I can guarantee that Ivan will not only lose everything in the divorce, but he'll also face charges for attempting to flee the jurisdiction to avoid child support. That's a felony in this state." "What about Loretta?" I asked. "Conspiracy to commit fraud, accessory to attempted flight to avoid financial responsibility, and potentially aiding and abetting tax evasion since she knew about the hidden assets. She's going down too." It was around this time that I discovered something else that made Ivan's betrayal even more personal. While going through our shared computer to gather more evidence, I found a folder I had never seen before. It was hidden deep in the system files, probably thinking I would never find it. The folder contained dozens of internet searches about spina bifida, genetic testing, and disability resources. The timestamps showed that Ivan had been researching Beth's condition not after she was born, but during my pregnancy. He had known. Somehow, he had suspected that something was wrong, and instead of discussing it with me or preparing to support our family, he had been researching how to get out of his responsibilities. Even worse, the search history showed that he had been looking up information about terminating pregnancies for genetic abnormalities, even though we were well past that point in the pregnancy. There were searches about defective babies, burden of disabled children, and giving up disabled children for adoption. The most disturbing search of all was from 2 weeks before Beth was born: legal ways to abandon disabled child. Ivan had been planning to abandon Beth from the moment he suspected she might have challenges. His reaction in the hospital wasn't shock or grief, it was relief that he finally had an excuse to execute a plan he'd been developing for months. This discovery changed everything for me. I realized that I hadn't just married a man who couldn't handle a crisis, I had married a man who was fundamentally incapable of love or loyalty when it required any sacrifice on his part. I printed out every single search, every page he had visited, every forum post he had read about abandoning disabled children. It all went into the evidence file, building an unshakable case that Ivan's abandonment was premeditated and malicious. When I showed this evidence to Dr. Crane during one of Beth's appointments, his face went pale. "Claudia, this level of planning to abandon a child is deeply disturbing. Has Ivan ever shown signs of antisocial behavior before?" "I thought he was just selfish," I said. "But now I'm realizing it was much more than that. He's incapable of empathy. Beth isn't a burden to him, she's an inconvenience, and he'll do anything to avoid inconvenience." Dr. Crane recommended that I document everything and consider requesting supervised visitation if Ivan ever tried to claim parental rights in the future. Men who plan to abandon disabled children sometimes change their minds years later when they want to appear reformed or when they need something, he warned. But their fundamental character doesn't change. Beth's safety should always be your primary concern. The thought that Ivan might someday try to insert himself back into Beth's life for his own selfish reasons made my blood boil. But I was building a legal fortress around my daughter that would make it impossible for anyone to hurt her again. Phase 2 of my plan began 6 months later when the IRS finished their investigation. The construction company owed over $80,000 in back taxes and penalties. Ivan and his father were facing potential criminal charges for tax fraud. The business was going to be sold to pay the debt, which meant both of them were about to be unemployed. That's when Doris called me for the first time since the hospital. "Claudia?" she said when I answered the phone. Her voice was shaky, desperate. "We need to talk." "I'm sorry, who is this?" I replied sweetly. "I don't know anyone by that name." "Don't play games with me, Claudia. You know what you've done to this family. Ivan is devastated. His father might go to prison. This is all your fault." "My fault?" I laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. "My fault for exposing the criminal activity I discovered while doing your books? My fault that Ivan committed adultery? My fault that all of you abandoned a disabled baby? That thing isn't part of this family," she spat. "We never wanted it, and we never will." "Good," I said calmly. "Because Beth and I want nothing to do with your family either. But since you called, you should know that I'm not done yet. This is just the beginning." I hung up and blocked her number. I was through with all of them trying to contact me only when they needed something. The third phase of my plan was the most satisfying. Ivan had been trying to hide assets, moving money around and trying to claim he was broke. But I had been married to him for 3 years, and I knew all his hiding spots. More importantly, Maria the private investigator was very good at her job. We discovered that Ivan had opened 3 secret bank accounts and had been funneling money into them for months, probably preparing for the divorce he was planning even before Beth was born. We also found out that he had bought Loretta expensive jewelry and had put a down payment on a condo for the 2 of them to live in after he divorced me. All of this information went straight to Karen, who presented it to the judge with a smile. Ivan's attorney tried to claim that the money was for legitimate business expenses, but the receipts for Loretta's jewelry and the condo made it pretty clear what was really going on. The judge was not amused. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Rebecca Murphy said sternly, "not only did you abandon your disabled infant daughter, commit adultery, and attempt to hide marital assets, but you also lied to this court about your financial situation. I'm awarding Mrs. Johnson 60% of all marital assets, full custody of the minor child, and spousal support of $1,200 per month for the next 5 years. Ivan's face turned purple. "Your Honor, that's impossible. I don't have that kind of money." "You should have thought of that before you decided to be a deadbeat father and an adulterous husband," the judge replied coldly. Furthermore, I'm ordering you to maintain health insurance for your daughter and to pay for 50% of all medical expenses related to her condition. These are not negotiable terms, Mr. Johnson. If you fail to comply, you will be held in contempt of court. I watched Ivan storm out of the courtroom with a satisfaction I had never felt before. Justice was sweet, but I still wasn't finished. Phase 4 targeted my parents. This one was more complex because they were more careful with their finances than Ivan had been. But they had made their own mistakes over the years, mistakes that I had been keeping track of without even realizing it. My father Robert worked for the city as a building inspector, and my mother Marion was a high school principal. Both were supposed to be pillars of the community, respected public servants. But I knew things about them that the general public didn't. I knew that my father had been taking bribes from contractors for years, allowing substandard work to pass inspection in exchange for cash payments. I knew because he used to brag about it at family dinners, thinking it was clever how he was making the system work for him. I had recorded some of those conversations on my phone, originally just as funny family memories, but now they served a different purpose. I also knew that my mother had been embezzling money from the school's activity fund for over 5 years. She had been using it to pay for her gambling addiction, something she thought nobody knew about. But I had seen the casino receipts in her purse, had noticed the patterns in her behavior, and had even followed her there one night when I was suspicious. I turned all of this information over to the appropriate authorities. My father's bribery evidence went to the FBI and the city's Internal Affairs Division. My mother's embezzlement evidence went to the school district's Fraud Investigation Unit and the State Attorney General's office. Within 6 weeks, both of them were suspended from their jobs pending investigation. Within 4 months, both were arrested. The local newspaper had a field day with it. Respected city officials charged with corruption was the headline that ran on the front page, complete with photos of both of them being led away in handcuffs. That's when Marion finally called me. "Claudia, please," she sobbed into the phone. "We're your parents. How could you do this to us?" "I'm sorry, you have the wrong number," I replied calmly. "I don't have any parents. My parents died the day they abandoned their granddaughter in a hospital." "She's disabled." Marion screamed. "We couldn't handle that kind of responsibility." "You're right," I agreed. "You couldn't handle the responsibility of being decent human beings. That's why you're going to prison." I hung up and blocked their number too. The final phase of my revenge was the most comprehensive. I had spent over a year documenting every cruel thing that had been said to me, every way I had been abandoned and betrayed. I had screenshots, recordings, witnesses, and documentation for everything. I created a detailed blog post titled How My Family Abandoned My Disabled Baby and What I Did About It. I didn't use anyone's real names, but I included enough details that anyone who knew the people involved would recognize them immediately. The post gained significant attention within our local community. It was shared hundreds of times across social media platforms, with people expressing outrage at my family's behavior and support for how I had handled the situation. Local news stations picked up the story. Several disability advocacy blogs wrote about it. It became a powerful example of how people with disabilities are still mistreated by some families, and how one mother fought back against that injustice. Ivan, Doris, and my parents suddenly found themselves dealing with not just legal troubles, but public shame as well. Their neighbors knew what they had done. Their co-workers knew. Their friends knew. Everyone in town was talking about the family that threw away a disabled baby and the mother who destroyed them for it. Ivan tried to contact me one more time, about 18 months after everything had come to light. He was living in a 1-bedroom apartment, working 2 part-time jobs because he couldn't find anything better with his legal troubles. Loretta had left him as soon as his money ran out. His mother Doris was working as a cashier at a grocery store, trying to pay rent on a studio apartment. "Claudia," he said when I answered the phone. "I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I want to see Beth. I want to try to be a father to her." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. He sounded broken, defeated, genuinely remorseful for the first time since I'd known him. But then I looked over at Beth, who was playing on the floor with her physical therapy toys. She was almost 2 years old now, and despite her challenges, she was the most joyful, loving child I'd ever known. She had already had 3 surgeries, countless doctor appointments, and months of therapy, but she faced everything with a smile. She didn't need a father who saw her as defective. She deserved better than that. "Ivan," I said quietly, "Beth doesn't need you. She has never needed you. The day you walked out of that hospital room, you stopped being her father. The day you called her defective and me defective for giving birth to her, you lost any right to be part of our lives. But I'm different now, he pleaded. I've learned from my mistakes. I want to make it right. You can't make this right, I told him. There is no making this right. You don't get to abandon your child when she needs you most and then come back when it's convenient for you. Beth and I have built a beautiful life without you, and we're going to keep it that way. Please, Claudia. I'm begging you. Let me try to be a better man. The time for that was 2 years ago when your daughter was born, I said firmly. You made your choice then, and I made mine. We're done here, Ivan. Don't call me again. I hung up and blocked his number. Today, Beth is 4 years old, and she's absolutely thriving. She's learning to walk with the help of leg braces and a walker, which is typical progress for her level of spina bifida. She's speaking in full sentences, and she has the most infectious laugh in the world. We live in a beautiful house that I bought with my settlement money from the divorce. I started my own bookkeeping business, which has become quite successful because word got around that I'm very good at finding financial irregularities. I never remarried, but I didn't need to. Beth and I have each other, plus Gina, who became like a sister to us, and an amazing support network of other special needs families. We're happy, we're secure, and we're loved. Ivan is working 2 jobs now to keep up with the child support payments, which the court garnishes directly from his paycheck so he can't try to avoid them. His father James spent 6 months in federal prison for tax fraud, and their construction business was sold at auction. Doris is still working at the grocery store, though she was able to move into a slightly nicer apartment. My parents both served time for their respective crimes. Robert got 18 months for accepting bribes, and Marion got 2 years for embezzlement and gambling with public funds. They lost their pensions, their reputations, and their freedom. When they were released, they tried to contact me once more, but I had moved by then and left no forwarding address. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about what I did to them. If I think my revenge was too harsh, too complete, too devastating. My answer is always the same. I look at my beautiful daughter, who lights up every room she enters despite her challenges, and I remember how each of these people looked at her like she was garbage to be thrown away. I remember how they abandoned us in our moment of greatest need, how they turned their backs on an innocent baby because she wasn't perfect in their eyes. And then I remember that everything that happened to them was a direct result of their own choices and actions. I didn't create their criminal behavior, I just exposed it. I didn't make Ivan abandon his family, I just made sure he faced consequences for it. I didn't force my parents to steal and take bribes, I just made sure the authorities knew about it. They destroyed themselves through their own cruelty and greed. I just lit the fuse on the bomb they had built. Beth will never know what it's like to be unwanted or unloved, because I made sure that everyone who couldn't love her unconditionally was removed from our lives permanently. She will grow up knowing that she is perfect exactly as she is, and that her mother will move heaven and earth to protect her. As for those who abandon us, they learned an important lesson: actions have consequences, and some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. They chose to see my daughter as less than human, and in return, they lost their humanity, their freedom, and their futures. I didn't cry when I held my daughter for the first time in that hospital room, surrounded by people who called her defective and worthless. I stayed silent and planned their destruction instead. And looking back now, over 2 years later, I've never regretted it for a single day. The best revenge, I learned, isn't getting even. It's building a life so beautiful and successful that your enemies can only watch from the sidelines as you thrive without them. Beth and I are living proof that love, determination, and strategic planning can overcome any obstacle, even family members who mistake cruelty for strength. We won. They lost. And that's exactly how it should be.